BSI has many thousands of national standards in its catalogue. I don't think I've been to a launch of a standard that is more timely, more relevant, more necessary than the one we're going to talk about today. So thank you very much for joining us. Many of you will be making decisions today in the polling booths as well, because we have local council elections across England and indeed around the UK. And many of you, I'm sure, will have consumer vulnerability in your mind when you make your decisions about who you vote for today. So hopefully this standard really resonates, and what we talk about this afternoon at the Consumer Conference, for those of you who are staying, really resonates as well. I'm David Bell, I'm the Director of Standards Policy at BSI, the British Standards Institution, and it's a pleasure to be the host for this launch this morning of this new international standard. A few words of housekeeping before we begin. The exits, I believe, are over there. We always say don't take the lifts, but especially today, don't take the lifts if you need to get out. And the toilets and everything else is over there as well. So follow one of the BSI badged blue, I think the staff look blue black badges. Sorry, follow somebody with a black badge, that's the way. And we muster, I believe, out on Lincoln's Inn Fields out the front. So the aim today is to provide an insight into this new, recently published British standard, which is an ISO standard, so it's a global standard, ISO 22458, I've got to get the number right, on consumer vulnerability. And I'm pleased that we've got experts who were part of that committee that developed it with us today. We've also got a panel for you shortly where we can ask questions and interrogate the content of the standard a little bit more. But first, it's a pleasure to welcome the chair of the ISO committee, Michael Hill. Michael, over to you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, actually, chairing this particular sort of committee. I was involved back in 2010 with 18477, particularly with the launch of that as a standard. And so this has been a wonderful opportunity to look at how we bring that up to date. And if we go back in time to 2010, we had, as a sort of country, just had the Equality Act introduced, which also introduced the concept of protected characteristics. So, of course, aspects such as age, gender, sexuality, faith, disability, and that was then very much ingrained within the sort of culture of sort of companies, organisations, in course ensuring fair, non-discriminatory interactions with their services. But behind the scenes, of course, there had been work going on with the development of 18477, the inclusive service sort of standard. That had been driven by consumer stakeholder groups, government, really sort of recognising that there was a need to provide a toolkit for particularly sort of business, especially those providing essential services, in ensuring that they took sort of steps to protect those who were most vulnerable in society. But what we've seen is then over the years a development, particularly within the regulated sort of markets, where there's been a broadening of our understanding of vulnerability, particularly starting to understand more situational aspects. So, for example, if someone's experiencing a relationship sort of breakdown, sort of bereavement, income shock, and how that may well impact the way they interact and are potentially put in place of harm by the way an organisation behaves. So in 2013, we saw, for example, in the energy market, Ofgem, the regulator, introduced a strategy that put in place almost a requirement for the use of 18477, so that energy suppliers and the energy sort of networks were again encouraged to take steps to look after those who are most vulnerable, but again also starting to have that understanding of that situational vulnerability. In 2019, So as it really, of course, just before we, as it had the sort of pandemic, the Competition and Markets Authority published a paper which again really highlighted the importance of understanding the more sort of situational aspects of consumer sort of vulnerability, but also set the scene in terms of encouraging, again, regulators, government to take further steps. So we've seen then really quite a number of regulators continue to develop policies and sort of guidance. So energy, Ofgem, the Financial Conduct Authority, only sort of last year issued further sort of guidance. Ofcom for, of course, the communications sector, the water industry with Ofwat, the legal services as a board, all these different bodies and more, understanding that there's often a need to put in place, whether it's regulatory rules or guidance to encourage firms to protect those who are most vulnerable. So with this kind of evolution of our understanding of consumer vulnerability, it really then got to the point where we needed to look back at what we'd done on 18477 to actually bring that up to date. And also, of course, then it's that understanding of there's a global sort of context. This isn't something that just impacts the UK. There were countries around the world also sort of taking sort of further steps. Australia, with its financial services sort of regulation, was putting in place measures to protect those experiencing financial hardship. So there we had that, again, as it broadening, as understanding, and with the sort of committee that we sort of put in place, PC 311, the facilitation by BSI Secretariat. We also had a UK as it mirror, as it committee, and 16 sort of countries involved. And that was sort of fantastic. There was such good engagement, especially given the fact that we started, of course, pre-pandemic. We were having, of course, meetings where we were all sort of face-to-face together and had to, of course, quickly adapt when the pandemic started to online meetings. But we had input from Australians, of course, talking about the impact of climate change and some of the issues, of course, that arose around impacting consumers there. Japan and its focus upon older generations and again, some of the learning that they sort of brought through. So we were getting good input from many different sort of countries, as well as, of course, then having it all become so topical, really, because of the impact also of the pandemic and the wider sort of understanding of how these sort of environmental sort of factors can also impact consumer vulnerability. And I'm now just going to hand over to sort of Sadie, who's going to actually provide some input from other countries.
Thanks, Michael. And you'll see we've adapted to our vulnerability today by having a slightly different setup. But I'll just go on to the next slide. So I'm Sadie Dainton. I'm BSI's Consumer Policy Lead, and also very honoured to be the chair of ISO COPOLCO, which I'll just mention in a minute. So international standards. We wanted to bring to you the international flavour of this standard. As you know, you recognise consumer vulnerability is recognised across the world as both a societal and business concern. And it's been completely exacerbated from the rapid growth of e-commerce, cross-border trade, and, as Michael's mentioned, a number of world issues that have struck us over the last few years. The way the standard was driven from BSI, from the UK, was a recognition by those consumer stakeholders that were involved, and government and regulators, in the need for an international recognition of this growing problem. We took that through ISO COPOLCO, and just to mention ISO COPOLCO, it's actually, people always call it Acapulco, but we wish. But it advises ISO on policy and standards-related matters from a consumer perspective. It brings national standards bodies and consumer stakeholders together to highlight key global policy, consumer policy issues, and share best practice to build consumer participation at a national level. And I hope when you hear Julie Hunter, who's chair of CPIN, and Nikki Stopford, who's chair of our Consumer Forum, you'll recognise the importance that BSI put on consumer stakeholder participation and the value that brings to our standards. So we took the British standard, and luckily we have huge support from around the globe, from all the other national standards bodies, who not only voted it positively but also participated. So say the importance of that, again, as Michael said, is bringing those different cultures, different experiences to really internationalize and strengthen the approach to the standard. So we also mentioned BSI, as we had proposed the standard through ISO, put its hand up and took the International Secretariat, and also proposed the chair, which is what you need to get these standards going. So you not only can just put them forward, you really have to support and drive the development of them. And at a UK level, when we got the standard approved to start work at the international level, through consumer policy, we reached out to more than 18 organisations that worked across vulnerability issues. You can see some of them there, and brought them together to really hone what was going to be the UK position from a consumer stakeholder perspective, but also working very closely, as you'll see from our next panel, with business, with regulators, with government, to make sure we had a truly multi-stakeholder voice into that international committee. And as with any standard, building consensus for global best practice can take some time when you're trying to bring at least 16 country experts together. But also when that standard's voted through, the whole of the ISO community have to vote positively. So we really have to make sure that the standard meets the needs of all stakeholders. And just to bring a bit of the international flavour, I'd like to introduce to you two people who have participated in the development of this standard, but also happen to be part of COPOLCO and work at the international level to drive consumer policy interest in the development of ISO standards. I'll ask Helen to do this bit because I don't have the capacity. But yeah, just take a listen to
Hello, I'm
these
Jean
people.
Bank. I'm chair of the Canadian Mirror Committee to ISO 22458. And I just want to thank everybody at BSI and the Consumer Network for asking me to participate in this event, even if it is virtual. I would have loved to have been with you in person. And I think the biggest thing for me was that going into this project, we essentially were reframing the concept of consumer vulnerability. So rather than the traditional view in standards that vulnerability was based on a label that you put onto a consumer, whether that might be age or gender or disability, but that we needed to look at it in a much more dynamic way, in that any consumer could be vulnerable at any time, depending on their circumstances or the situation that they found themselves in. And certainly what we've seen recent weeks in the conflict in the Ukraine, or even the pandemic over the last 2 years, and certainly the number of emergencies and natural disasters that we've seen in Western Canada over the last year, is that really underscores just that dynamic aspect of vulnerability and the importance of being able to look at it in a different way. And to also recognize that in the marketplace, the way that organizations design and deliver services can create situations where consumers are suffering harm because they don't understand the information and it's not provided to them in a way that is inclusive. So it's that reframing of vulnerability, which I think is really, really important in the document, plus all of the very practical guidance that's given in the standard for organizations for them to provide services that are more inclusive to the marketplace. Just to wrap up, I think that at a personal level, I want to see us rethink about the issue of consumer vulnerability. Last year I was hospitalized for about 10 weeks from a fairly serious injury. And so my new motto coming out of that experience was, don't judge my story by the chapter that you just walked in on. So I'm hoping that this standard will make us all a little bit less judgmental and more understanding of the aspects around consumer vulnerability.
Why Malaysia wanted to be involved in this standard? So Malaysia became involved so that to understand how vulnerable consumer can be better catered to achieve fair and equitable treatment in obtaining services. And our participation in the WG also to interact with others in this area of work and obtain information on how the issue is handled in other countries. Also, there is no code or standard in Malaysia currently that provides guidance on best practices in the service industry to serve and to access vulnerable consumer. And what are the most important issues covered from our perspective is the standard is particularly helpful in provides a comprehensive operational definition of consumer vulnerability. The standard is also very detailed, comprehensive. It provides the rationale, the manner in which the standards can be implemented and how its implementation can be monitored. It is particularly helpful in which vulnerable consumer may be proactively identified by the service provider. And how do we think that ISO 22458 will help Malaysia? The National Standards Body, Departments of Standards Malaysia, through the National Bureau Committee, in the process of developing an action plan for publicizing ISO standards on vulnerable consumers. And our hope is that the standard will initially be voluntary, and during this stage, we will undertake a campaign to publicize a standard and work with institutions that are willing to adopt the standard. It will initially focus on public utilities, electricity, water, communication, financial sectors. Malaysia hope that there will be a point at which the standards will become mandatory, and for this, we have to work with the regulatory agencies. Thank you.